2018 recipient of the Shirk Impact Award, the highest award for research achievement and impact in Canada. And today we are going to talk about 2 cases that she has been deeply involved in. Feel free to question and comment, and I believe we're going to switch over to a different set of slides.
Great. Are you seeing the slides all right, Julian?
Yes.
Great.
Thank you.
Let's assume everyone else is. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I think this may be my first experience of giving a webinar. I've watched lots of them with great interest. I think it's an incredible resource that the Zehr Institute offers to us all to have the opportunity to learn together virtually and then to create what's a pretty impressive long-standing body of work and knowledge that we can all draw on. So I'm really grateful to have been invited to have the opportunity to be part of that, having benefited from learning from it for so long. So today I do want to talk to you a little bit about 2 cases, but I'm using those cases as an opportunity to actually talk a little bit about what a restorative approach to inquiry, to institutions and models of public inquiry that go by different names depending on where we are in the world, whether those are review commissions or commissions, sometimes truth commissions, although I won't be talking directly about those sets of issues in transitional justice contexts. The connection is clearly there. They also sometimes are internal reviews and the sorts of inquiry processes that we do to understand an issue or something that's happened, and then to come up with our findings and then recommendations. I'm also doing this, though, as a way to help us think more deeply, because I think it does prompt us to think more deeply about some of the ways in which we think about the role of a restorative approach to inquiry, but also of the process of inquiry, of figuring out what happened and what matters about that within restorative processes. And so I'll say a little bit about that and then be able to ground that in some concrete examples from Nova Scotia in Canada, where I am, of some of the work that we've been doing to try to approach restorative inquiries differently. So just to say a few things about legal inquiries. The sort of maybe most official of those, certainly in the Canadian context, and I know in others, is when either a royal commission, so now you can tell I'm Canadian because we still would use the term royal, or a commission of inquiry, or a public inquiry. We have a Public Inquiries Act in Nova Scotia, as many provinces do, and as I know is available in many countries. And typically, these sorts of instruments are used and called for when there's been a significant public attention to an issue or a problem or an occurrence. And really the instinct is people want something done about it. And sometimes that something is either beyond what they believe the justice system can or should deal with, or there's a kind of a public profile and urgency to it that it demands a different kind of attention. And that means that lots of times issues that call for these kinds of reviews or inquiries are thought to be of public significance and public importance to understand and to address and to deal with. Public inquiries, though, are often very familiar in their structure, right? We use the kinds of mechanisms and tools that we have available to us from the traditional legal system often to structure those kinds of inquiries. They often are headed by folks who are legally trained, so whether that be judges who are commonly appointed to public inquiries, or panels of people that include lawyers and judges, and every once in a while some other folks with different kinds of skills and life experience. Public inquiries are often then conducted according to the sorts of procedural rules and processes that are familiar from legal processes, and are very often tasked with fact-finding, and do so depending upon lots of the adversarial kinds of approaches to finding fact and seeking truth that are common in our court and legal processes. In the course of that, then, what the long-standing experience now with public inquiries has been is that that they're not all that successful in meeting the very reasons that they were called. So the people who are most affected often feel like they're about them but not including them. It's difficult to participate other than to give evidence, and to do that in pretty rigid ways, or to do that in ways that feel like that's the only contribution they'll make, and the sort of making sense of and saying what matters about what's happened is a process left to those who are appointed commissioners and judges to sort of figure out and then tell everybody what to do. They often can be, in that regard, quite re-traumatizing for those who've been through very difficult issues and events that are subject to these inquiries. And there's actually significant responses from those who are inside of systems and governments that often get called to testify in front of inquiries and reviews, who also find it quite harmful and difficult, in part because typically the fact-finding phase of those are very focused on looking back to determine who is to blame, what happened, who is at fault, and what happened, with a view to then making recommendations in the form of often part of a report that then all of those kinds of bodies who are found to be responsible should carry out. That is, I think, one of the reasons why we have seen in many cases these kinds of mechanisms less effective than we might hope or expect. Often the recommendations will receive lots of attention at the issuing of a report. Governments and others responsible usually now say the sort of right sorts of things, and then set about the work of managing those recommendations. And in some respect, that's not about bad faith or a lack of will. In many cases, because of the ways in which those recommendations are discerned by an individual or a small group of people without maybe all of the knowledge that they might need about what's happened since this incident or how systems work, recommendations can fall flat in terms of really understanding the nature of the issue or the nature of the systems and how change might happen. So they can be not as effective or ineffective in some cases at actually getting at the issues. And they also can be quite short-lived, and in part that's because of the realities of political systems in which they're called, right? Sometimes they're thought to be owned by or the problem of a particular government, and then as those governments move on, the purchase of those kinds of inquiry processes passes. So these kinds of critiques of public inquiries haven't actually dented the number of times we hear people call for them. And in part, I think this has everything to do with looking for those kinds of mechanisms that can really make a difference when something of significance to the public, something really matters. And so in the two cases that I'm going to talk to you about, and in other situations, we've seen those who are most affected by situations and issues coming forward saying, we want this, but we want it to be effective. We want to participate. We want this to go and work in a different way. And we've seen people sort of capture visions for how that might work differently. From truth commissions and other sorts of processes where we've seen people seek a different pathway forward. So one of those pathways I think that we're seeing emerging and that deserves some significant attention is to think about what it would look like to approach these kinds of public inquiry processes and commissions restoratively. So the slide sort of indicates what some of those principles are that for those of us who work in the area of restorative justice will be quite familiar. But they are quite interesting when you contrast them with the way in which these sorts of inquiry processes and commission processes tend to work. Right? So rather than being structured in ways that is about adversarial processes, so calling people to testify, interrogating what they say, inviting different sides and different representatives of those perspectives, or even the kinds of process and procedure that's familiar in legal structures around how information can be heard and received and submitted. A restorative approach to these sorts of processes would challenge that framework and try to think about how we could design mechanisms that are more collaborative or oriented to learning and understanding, are more inclusive and participatory, not just in terms of being able to give information, but in the discerning of what happened and what needs to happen, right? In the process that's usually the preserve of commissioners or those who head inquiries. In that way, we're empowering those who are connected, both because they're affected or because they have responsibilities or an interest in the outcome. They'll be guided then by a norm to seek to structure those processes in a way that causes less harm, no further harm to those who've been affected, and less harm to those who are coming into the process to be a part of it. And the orientation is slightly different because while we hope these mechanisms will make a difference, we often approach them now by saying if only they can find the facts, determine what happened, then the forward focus part is left to the recommendations at the end of the process. Approaching this kind of a process restoratively, as we'll see in the examples that we'll look at in a second, really reorients the goal. Like, why are we doing this process? We're looking back in order to be able to figure out what needs to happen next, and that forward focus really affects how it is that what has happened and the fact finding is approached. It tends to be consistent with the way in which we work restoratively, a more facilitated process, which changes the role of commissioners, changes the role of those who are leading these sorts of processes in terms of their responsibility not being the fact finder or the person around whom all of the activities are oriented, but rather facilitating those who are affected and involved to come together and to figure out what happened and what matters about what happened together. And it also can, within the process of the inquiry itself, think about the opportunity to model the sort of culture change, the sort of coming together and having people understand different perspectives and make plans and actions that we think is necessary to a different way forward. So within the process itself, rather than to make that often recommendations following the public inquiry. So just before we look at the examples, I want to say something about why this might matter and ought to matter, I think, to those of us who work in the area of restorative justice or who are thinking about a restorative approach. So for sure, there's lots of promise in bringing our knowledge about restorative processes to thinking differently about these sort of inquiry-like processes. But I think there's also something in when you do that, helping think about the role of inquiry, of finding facts, of truth-telling within restorative processes in the mainstream in terms of how they're used in restorative justice. It's often the case that we think about restorative justice as happening after that kind of determination of truth through one mechanism or another has happened, either because a case or a situation has been settled, because someone has issued an acceptance of responsibility, or because there's been a finding of guilt, or even there's already been sentencing or some sort of resolution to the case, and this is taking up the task of healing or reconciliation following that kind of acknowledgement. I don't have any issue that those are really significant and important roles to be thinking about working restoratively, nor that all restorative processes should sort of be thinking about the capacity to do that kind of work. But I do think we shortchange what actually is happening in those restorative processes when we don't talk openly about the process of inquiring into what happened, of truth finding, right? So this idea that these processes tend to happen after acknowledgements of responsibility belies the fact that in the processes themselves, what's most effective and powerful is having people come to understand not just the facts, but what matters about those facts and how we need to make that matter for the future, for planning and action, for where do we go from here? What are the outcomes? What are the needs? And I think we don't pay a lot of attention in the scholarship or in the practice of restorative justice to talking about that process that's happening in terms of how restorative justice is working, but also paying some attention to how it ought to happen. So why is it important that we think about the role of investigation, of finding facts, of figuring out what happened, and of figuring out what matters about what happened within restorative processes, and that it's important for us to be paying more attention to that. And this provocative kind of idea that these institutions that have as their main goal to be inquiring and figuring out what happened, that's better done, or we have better outcomes if we do that restoratively, I think shines a light on that capacity of restorative justice. So I want to talk to you about two stories, sort of briefly, maybe as a chance to create fodder for your questions and your imagination, and also to draw your attention to them more broadly, where you may want to go and learn more. One is a process that happened in 2015 at the university I'm talking to you from, at Dalhousie University. That certainly grasped significant Canadian national attention and some elsewhere around the world as well. And that was the case of a private Facebook group at the Faculty of Dentistry, where 13 men in the class, in the fourth year class in the Faculty of Dentistry, were found to have been participating in a private Facebook group that contained lots of interactions and information. It wasn't just dedicated to sexist and misogynist comments, but certainly the character and tenor of some of those exchanges and conversations were reflective of a culture of disrespect and disregard, of sexism, and replicating some of the misogynist ideas both in the profession and in the culture. And when that was discovered by their classmates, who were the target of many of those comments, the women who were most affected were very clear that what they wanted to happen was a different kind of response. And so I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. And the second example, which I'll introduce, is the current public inquiry that is actually just winding up. I'm a commissioner on a public inquiry here that has taken a restorative approach from its very inception and design all the way through the work of the inquiry, and its report will be forthcoming in the next couple of months. And so I'll talk a little bit about how that has been structured and the difference that we've been seeing that has made. And you'll see this sites there for you to be able to go back to. One is the top one will give you the report of the Dal dentistry process. So I'll tell you in more detail aspects of the restorative process that was held there. And the lower one is the website for the inquiry, where ultimately our report will be and where our public reports to this point are. So Dalhousie Dentistry. So as I said, the women who were involved in this situation, that was their classmates, a very small class in fourth year dentistry. There were 19 women and 19 men, and this involved 13 of those men that were named on the Facebook site that we had evidence of. And in fact, others came forward as part of this process and participated because they had some connection to the site as well. And it was about their classmates, the 19 women that they had been going to school with for several years. And those women were really clear that, of course, this was unacceptable, and they were upset and hurt and angry and all of those things about the treatment from their classmates. But they were also more upset because they weren't surprised by that treatment, in the sense that it reflected some of their experiences and their concerns about the culture at the faculty, in the profession, at the university, and more broadly, of course, in society. And so they actually asked for what they thought was more than the typical response, which would have been individualized and reactive to the behavior of those particular men. They wanted those men to be responsible, to be part of examining what they had done and part of the solution, but they also wanted to ensure that the faculty, the profession, and the university saw themselves as contributing to and responsible for part of what had happened, and certainly responsible for the way forward. for the change that they saw was needed, and they wanted this to be a catalyst for. And so they asked for a restorative response. You'll see in the pictures on the screen, this was an unexpected response from many who saw the solution would be to expel misogyny in the form of these 13 men, that was the messaging that needed to happen. And I think their belief that would have contributed to taking this seriously and to bringing and to making change. What is interesting about this as an example of restorative inquiry, it's interesting for on a whole bunch of levels in terms of thinking about how to take a restorative approach to these sorts of issues, but was that this approach didn't happen just simply after the men said we did it, right? Of course, they did actually say, yes, like this is us, this was our problem. But there was an element that was very important here that was about investigating what happened. So this was not just about putting people in a room. This was the stereotype that was immediately raised, where we would put the men in a room with the women and let the women determine their punishment or do just healing. A significant amount of the process was actually about understanding what happened, the circumstances and conditions that led up to that, and doing that together, right? So coming to understand the facts of the situation, right, by working with all of the individual parties and coming to understand what happened, and then laying that out back before those who were affected, answering questions, looking further, coming to understand it, and then thinking about how is it that we could bring people together to come to understand what matters about these facts and what happened. How do we understand this? And how do we understand it in a way that's focused on making a difference, on taking action, on what needs to happen next? And that wouldn't just have been the stage at which we'd make recommendations after our investigation, but rather we would stick with it as a process and say, once we've come to understand what happened and we think we know what needs to happen next, how do we begin to make some plans together with those who need to carry that forward? And so the restorative process interestingly, at the Faculty of Dentistry, for the students who were in the 2015 class, many of them left the immediate process that was thinking about that Facebook site. But what followed were aspects of a continuing restorative approach to engaging in the questions of culture at the faculty that were raised and revealed during the process. And so this is sort of the untold story about the impact and the process of inquiry that was undertaken in a restorative way, was that it actually set up the ability to continue to inquire what's happening here, what's going on here, how do we dig deeper in this, and involved then the students from the years behind who were then coming up through the program, and the student leadership to continue to do that work in the years ahead, to be involved in a process that helped them come to understand what's happening, respond to it, think about how to make a difference, and then continue to be capable of thinking, how do we find out, how do we come to understand not only one another, but what's happening on the ground. And that kind of interrogation is really important if what the goal is culture change, because culture change doesn't happen by dealing with only one incident, right, and only one circumstance. It needs to see and understand and tackle the connections and the context, causes, and circumstances, because it's in those that culture replicates itself and where it lies. So the other example, I just we'll put that slide up for a second to say we had a conference at the sort of conclusion of this year after the dentistry restorative process, that brought together all sorts of experts from around the world, and those who were similarly thinking about the capacity of a restorative approach in this broader way to think about inquiry and culture change. And on the Schulich School of Law YouTube site, you can look for that international conference and hear some of the voices of those who were involved two of those pictures there, the woman in the blue sweater and the gentleman who looks very animated in mid conversation in the plaid shirt, were the co-facilitators of the dentistry process and sharing sort of what that experience was like in more detail if you're interested. And of course the woman with the shorter hair and the colored shirt was the lawyer in that circumstance. So it's interesting to hear the reflections of those from different circumstances, trying to deal with a new kind of approach to the way in which we would inquire about what happened and come to determine what needs to happen next and make these plans for the future. So the more traditional public inquiry approach then is the current approach to the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children in Nova Scotia. So the home is a child caring institution that operated in Nova Scotia. It opened in 1921. It operated until 2011. The institution was actually envisioned by the African Nova Scotian community as a way within a racialized society to be figuring out how to meet the needs of children and families in their community. And it was and continued to be for much of its operation a significant point of pride for the community, because they dedicated resources and support and energy to ensuring that there was such a home, and that it was an act of resilience of taking care of their own kids. Over the generations, we have then repeated stories, common stories across all the generations of children who lived there about their experiences there not being consistent with what it was that the community thought they were or wanted them to be. And so you can imagine how difficult and painful these revelations were for the community. And in fact, the community responded by finding them hard to believe. Which was experienced by the former residents who started to come forward as silencing and particularly painful. The experiences were of neglect, of mental, physical, and sexual abuse. They were abused by both staff, who were predominantly African Nova Scotian, and other residents, and the stories persist over those generations. So one of the things that I think has been is significant to sort of note is that this is then a very complicated story. So if we're actually trying to think about what it means to come to understand this story, right, to find facts, to do an inquiry, it isn't just a story about the institutionalized abuse that first brought it to public attention. It's very clear when you start to look at it that it's also about the experience and structure of the way in which we care, provide care, of those systems and structures that failed in this instance to provide good care. And it is deeply embedded in the history of systemic racism in this province, right? So we can't understand the experience of care and the struggles and structures around that, nor the results of failure and abuse without paying close attention to systemic racism. And so one of the things that is so significant about approaching inquiry in a way that can deal with that complexity, because it can bring different perspectives, different viewpoints together, but also have the opportunity for them to interact rather than just be filtered through a decision maker, is particularly poignant in a situation where there's such complexity. So the restorative inquiry came about because of the vision of former residents. Like the women in dentistry, former residents came forward and said, we want a public inquiry, but we don't want a public inquiry that we're not a part of. We want to be part of the process of figuring out what matters about this and where we go, and nothing about us without us. And the challenge was to design a public inquiry process that would be participatory in that way, that would attend to the nature of the harms as harms to trust and relationships, and that would create a process into which those who needed to be involved in order to move forward in a different way, to journey, what the former residents call their journey to light, to be part of that journey to light, required quite a different imagination about what public inquiries look like. And they landed on wanting that to look and feel like a restorative process. So the image you're seeing now is how we've sort of described the phases of work are not linear, of course. You start one phase and you keep building relationships and building people's understanding of how they are related to these issues, to these concerns, and to one another in this work. That the process is designed to be facilitating and supporting that kind of building of connection and of comprehensive understanding. And then builds upon that sort of appreciation of who needs to be involved in this process and how are we in this together, the opportunity to then begin to seek truth, to find out the facts of what happened and to make sense of them together. That's that process of collaborative learning and understanding. And to facilitate those processes for individual groups or organizations that were involved, to bring them together with others so that those truths are being shared. And the process of coming to understand across those different perspectives and to fill in the gaps of knowledge from the different ways people come into this process, given their knowledge or experience of the home and the abuses there and of the broader context. And then to ensure that within the process of that inquiry, where we're holding this idea of what do we know, then what do we do with that knowledge? And that stays as part of the process. So we'll be issuing a report in the coming weeks and months, and that report ought to be no surprise to those who facilitated those who participated in the process, because all the way along they've been arriving at this learning and understanding together. And the commissioners who sit on a council of parties and represent all of the central parties to this process have been facilitating those opportunities and facilitating and supporting the engagement of those parties together, and then helping them take the next step of figuring out where to from here. How do we make a difference? How do we act together in real time when we know better to do better? How do we plan what needs to happen next? And how do we capture that plan so that we're able to move forward following the inquiry? So what do we mean by restorative inquiry? I think these are the sorts of principles I've been talking about that then would drive a different approach to this kind of fact-finding and to the sorts of institutions and processes we design to be able to figure out what happened and to mobilize that knowledge for change. The restorative inquiry has been guided by the image of Sankofa, which is a symbol from Ghana, which literally translated means it's not taboo to go back and fetch it. Go back and get that which is good and bring it forward. And it's an image of, as you may have seen on the previous slide, I just won't go back to confuse us, of a bird with its neck craning back to gather an egg in its beak, but with its feet facing forward, signaling it's moving forward, which is this idea of going back, that the purpose of inquiry is to go back and gather that knowledge and that which we need to know in order to go forward in a good way. And that reorients, I think, the processes and mechanisms we need, who needs to be involved, and our thinking, our principled way of working in a restorative way is key and essential to that kind of fact-finding and inquiry. So this is just the kinds of outcomes that we're seeing, right? There really are ways in which we're building the capacity and the relationships and the understanding that's needed for the journey forward. And we're seeing those kinds of results, both in terms of individuals reporting that it's been significant and important and empowering and less harmful, but also the sorts of outcomes, the sorts of solutions, the sorts of ways forward that are possible when those who need to carry them forward are involved are quite different than what might be possible within a typical public inquiry or commission. So I put this slide up as just sort of fodder for our conversation or for the questions you might have. These are not, of course, the only examples of restorative inquiry. In the province of Nova Scotia, the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission and other commissions in Canada have slowly been following that lead, have been thinking about how to take a restorative approach, not just to settling human rights cases, but to the process of investigation and inquiry, of bringing parties together in that process of coming to learn and understand what happened, so they're able to think about how it matters and what needs to happen next. In the course of that work, we looked at a systemic situation for the Black firefighters in Nova Scotia that had been going on for decades, and the human rights complaint alone for 8 years. And we took a restorative approach to that process of understanding what happened and then moving forward. Recently, we took this approach to the investigation of an in-custody death in a jail of Jason LeBlanc, and coming to understand what happened there. The Mother Risk Commission in Ontario used these sorts of processes to come to better understand the impacts of faulty hair testing that resulted in the removal of children for significant periods of time as they were trying to move forward. And I think it does resonate with some of the imagination we've been seeing exercised around not all truth commissions, but truth and reconciliation commissions like South Africa, like Canada, sort of seeing that mobilization and move forward, and then other transitional justice mechanisms that are more reflective of traditional ways. Think about the significance and importance of this fact-finding, truth-seeking to be done restoratively as well, in part because the complexity of these situations mean that it's not that truth is relative and everybody has their own, it's that truth is relational, contextual, and needs a kind of process that can be robust and complex enough to discover truth and then mobilize it to make a difference. And so with that, I'll stop and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
All right, great. Thank you so much for that presentation. That was excellent. Very interesting stuff. If people have questions, please submit them in the Q&A box. And okay, yes. So I was wondering, with the case of the dentistry inquiry, what was the process like of establishing an RJ process within a culture that isn't exactly restorative? How do you like flip the script?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I think it applies to both cases in terms of what's the, I think one of the things that we've learned in both those cases that's been really important is trying to develop the process as you go. So this may get easier for all of us as the entire world becomes more restorative, which is in fact, the dream we're all working for. So let's assume that'll happen one day. Or at a minimum, other people have gone before doing processes that are somewhat similar. And so there's some model or expectation. So one thing I'd say is certainly in the early going of this, we had to be really intentional about doing education as we go. So being overt and clear about the process, right? Why we're doing it, what we're doing, helping people to navigate and understand how they're participating. I think so. That's one answer to your question, is I think you've actually we have to be really clear that if part of what's so attractive about working restoratively in these contexts is that we're building people's capacity, we're actually modeling through the way in which these inquiry processes work, the kinds of capacity, skill, understanding, encounter, ways of working that people need in order to walk out of that process and towards a future that continues to live out those plans, then we need to be clear and overt and transparent about that, and helping, dedicating some real time to helping people figure out how to show up in those processes in this way. So in the case of the inquiry for the Home for Colored Children, that's why it was so important that the design process for that inquiry was itself approached restoratively and facilitated and brought the parties together, so that we didn't just imagine this looks like a restorative process and as soon as people come into it, they'll know how to behave this way or will know what will work. The other I think facet of your question is how guarded in some sense you have to be about the terms and conditions in which these processes work if that's not how the broader system is working. And so as the dentistry report, we tried to be fairly honest. I kind of half joke that the report that we wrote out of dentistry with the party's permission, we kind of wrote it for this reason, which was it was a process that was hard for people to understand or to imagine. It was also a process that was hard to protect and secure the space for in the context of a culture that wanted to deal with the issue differently. So not just there was a sort of culture issues within the faculty or within there was a culture issue about how we solve problems like this, right? Enormous pressure for carceral kind of strategies, right? Punish and manage the issue that way and send messages that way. And a real interest in reputation management by institutions that want to be seen to do the right thing and don't want to take a risk on people not understanding this restorative process. And so I do think you need to think about how do you create, particularly if you're trying to do a process inside of an institution, how do you create space where there's enough independence, enough room to facilitate that, enough room to invite people to come into the process to work together in ways that can account for those power dynamics without the process being shut down or controlled or at the very point where it starts to unearth things people don't want to see. And I think that's one of the attractions to sort of public inquiries. They usually sit as these independent under a separate statute, having some authority that is protective of that independence. It turns out that independence is really important for the space to facilitate people coming into a safe space. And so I'd say there's a lot to think about in terms of creating the conditions in which those processes can be successful.
How did it come about that this process went in this way instead of another way? Like there were people obviously on all sides of the issue, but how did it actually come about that you were involved and the other people? And
yeah, so this does speak to the benefits of starting to build ecosystems around working restoratively. So one of the ways it came about, so how did the women in dentistry know to ask for something different? Is that we had been developing for some years in partnership with the local police a restorative justice program on campus for those who came into conflict with the law and those who on campus came into conflict with the student code of conduct, so violations of behavior and issues. And so we've been imagining what a restorative approach looked like on campus in those contexts, which meant that there were people in positions in campus security who were called when this happened because it was a matter of safety and security, those who worked in the office of equity and harassment prevention, who'd had exposure to thinking and working this way. And so when the women came in with an ask that was, change the culture, fix the culture, don't just send them out 13 angry men because we know why they're like that. Like we see it every day. You don't have it right. You don't know. That would just be a scapegoat. And they said, we want a bigger process. There was already some sense that they've seen processes like that before, or we can look at processes that are looking at root causes and contexts and circumstances. And so there was at least that moment of imagining, of being able to say, could we do this differently? And so I think that's was significant. All these stories have some happenstance. These were very compelling women. And we had a new president who met with them and who were compelled that in the first instance, he needed to pay attention to what those most affected wanted and needed, and the story that they were telling them that he believed about what was happening for them in the university. And so I think before maybe knowing what that would mean in terms of other people's expectations of what would happen, he said that it was their choice about how they would go forward and the university would support them. And in very difficult circumstances, he stayed true to those principles.
That brings me to another question of working within institutions that aren't restorative. Like not just the culture isn't restorative and the people aren't necessarily inclined to think restoratively, but that institutions tend to be conservative and
Yeah.
consume a restorative justice response instead of letting it actually live out its values. Can you speak to that either in the case of the university or with the province or any other large bodies you've worked with?
Yeah, so it's a great question, right? Because one of the real worries is institutions are meant to be enduring. They are meant to be stable. They aren't meant to be flexible and bendy easily, because they're meant to provide that sense of predictability and stability, which is then reinforced by culture, right? So not just structures are hard to change. If you change the structures, changing the culture and people's understanding and assumptions about the institutions is equally as hard. And so I think there is a real danger if the way we approach this is to come with models and practices, that those models and practices can be pretty easily co-opted in service of the institution, right? So we see this a lot with the ways in which people find space for reform that's not that threatening, that's not going to shake sort of the foundations or the way people think or the kind of logic of the system. We're going to accommodate it over here. It'll be an alternative. You can do it as an informal response. We have these tools and practices that we'll use, but we use them in a way that's still within our comfort zone of what's acceptable and how the system is structured. I think that's been one of the worries about whether or not these can make a lasting difference. I think it's one of the reasons to be very careful not to simply walk in and think the thing that will make the difference is changing what people do. So changing the process to be circles rather than the way they'd normally do it, or changing the set of practices. But you've really got to start with why they are doing things, why we are doing things differently, right? Change of heart and mind that then will follow a change in terms of how we do things and then what we do. And I think we often work backwards because we think the thing we can get some traction on in terms of institutional change, in terms of societal change, in terms of inquiries recommendation lists, is telling people what to do. We want them to do something different, so we tell them what to do, rather than crafting a process and an experience that shifts their thinking about why they are doing things and then how they need to do things. That principled approach about once I think differently, I will approach things differently. It's in that moment that you can get at culture and assumptions and ways of working that shifts at the foundation of the way institutions work. Institutions can endure changing what they do because they can keep doing it for the same reasons, right? And feeding the same sort of assumptions and structures and purposes. And so I do think these processes need to be thought about in terms of what is it that we're seeking to do here, right? What kind of change, right? How do we help people? And that process of starting at the what matters here, like starting at the level of inquiry rather than at well, now we have to figure out what to do about it, but there's an assumption we all know what the it is, that there is a really important space there in these processes where people actually get to rethink what matters here, what's this about, what are we doing?
Interesting. You spoke of changing hearts and minds, and that seems like part of the response to the Dalhousie dentistry case of changing the culture in the school. Do you have any sense of how those changes have been made so far, and if there's been any impact that's been noticeable?
Yeah, so I think we do have some sense. We have lots of evidence of what those sort of shifts are. One is the simple fact that the next group of students coming through who were not involved in Facebook and were not involved in this incident took up their responsibility, not just to follow the plan set out in the restorative process that happened for the students involved in Facebook, but actually to go back to that process of inquiry that those students undertook to be able to come to understand and interrogate what's still happening here in the culture, like to own that this is our place and ours to think through. That's led to some quite significant changes in terms of the way that they approach planning events, the way they think about inclusion, because at its core, those Facebook sites were about belonging and connection and ensuring you could help each other survive. They just had unhealthy ways of connecting and supporting and relating. Mm-hmm. And so they've made some quite significant changes and reinvested in them year over year in terms of the sorts of events, the kinds of ways they include one another, the way that they continue to ask questions about, is it going well? Who's not here? Who's not being included? All the way up to their engagements with the profession, and inviting, a learning day every year where they come to talk again about these issues. We've seen some really interesting ways in which it's emerging on campus, where other professional schools who all sort of were quite happy for this to be about dentistry are now coming forward and saying, can you come and tell us how you're doing things differently? Because this could be us too, in terms of the way we replicate these relationships and these cultures. And so I think in terms of the measure of success, I think it has to do with how are we equipping people with the capacity to work differently, to operate differently. The clinic works very differently in terms of how it is that we're bringing together those different professional groups to work together. So they have huddles at the beginning of the day to kind of understand where people are and where they are and their learning and what they need, because some of the incentivification for this was about unhealthy competition and unhealthy learning environments. And so we're sort of seeing people be able to work differently, right? How they do things and what they think about in terms of what matters has shifted and changed, I think, as a result of learning through this process.
Gotcha. Would you have anything to say to administrators or people at universities who are thinking about like preemptively creating culture or institutions within to actually like deal with these things maybe more proactively?
Now, one of the most profound things that profoundly impactful things that the students in the dentistry case said was that for many of them, so within the context of them wishing probably none of this ever happened, that this was one of the best things that happened in terms of the opportunity they had to support one another, to be part of a class and a learning community, to operate differently together by the end of the process, to have had the kinds of conversations they needed about professionalism, about understanding others who might be their patients, who might be their colleagues. And their question was, why did it take something like this for us to have the opportunity to learn together like this? And so some of their recommendations were exactly that. Why isn't this the way in which we are learning to be professionals? Because these are the skills, the capacity to have these difficult conversations, the capacity to understand different perspectives, the ability to talk to one another in this way where we feel sort of in this together and are trying to figure out our differences and our attitudes. This is what we need to be good professionals. And it wasn't, they have very good professors of ethics and professional practice, and they knew all the rules. They just didn't think they were really about them, right? Because no one sort of thinks they're going to be the problem, right? Or they're going to be the issue. And so the ethos of the way they were being educated wasn't reflecting all of that kind of reflective capacity and reflective learning and what we hope professionals will do. And I would say that about any institution, right? That if we have these norms about how we want people to be, when things go really wrong, we sometimes can glimpse how we need people to be behaving in that moment and changing and learning. And yet, we often don't invest in those opportunities on the day-to-day. So lots of the work that we've been doing in schools, for example, everywhere from sort of big kids on the university campus down to elementary schools, has seen the biggest effective change is when we actually are able to create that space for learning and understanding together what matters and what we need to do together on the everyday as part of the way the institution works. So this idea that, we suddenly need to learn, we suddenly need to inquire, we suddenly need to know what happened when things go really wrong, ought to make us ask, what do we wish we knew before? And how can we set up processes and systems where we can know that in real time rather than in these crisis moments?
It would be a very different process if all of those students had gone through elementary school with restorative practices.
Right. Yeah, it would be.
Would you be able to talk about cases of restorative inquiry, but maybe on like a larger scale than the dentistry case or the Nova Scotia home?
Right.
That like I'm imagining could lead to it just being so big that it might crush itself or not have the same impact of like these like more contained communities.
Right. So the Home for Colored Children one's, relatively large. It's, we're a small province, so for what it's worth, it's an example of where we need to be able to think differently about restorative processes, not just being about the circle or the one room or that we have to be able to think about how do we take a restorative approach to the way we're thinking about phases of the work. And how our understanding of how to facilitate that, how to think about the relationships that matter, how to think about the layered level of inquiry, figuring out what happened, figuring out what matters about that, and being able to stretch a restorative approach in a way that thinks at the level of not just a process, what happens in the room and how we facilitate what's going on, but the design and implementation of an institutional process to inquire and make a difference. So the Nova Scotia one's larger because of the focus on systemic racism. So really what we've been trying to construct is the opportunity to have these conversations about the home, but the mandate of the inquiry is about the home as illustrative, as an example of the impacts of systemic racism in the province. And so that's meant involving everyone from all of the ministers in the cabinet and circles and processes with them to the Department of Labor and Advanced Education, Justice, the police, education, to be thinking about who needs to be thinking in more integrated and holistic ways about our system of care and how it's working and how it's replicating systemic discrimination. And so that has that risk, right? Which is if you're imagining that that really the restorative moment is just in the room or just in the circle, or that it's just about facilitating those individual conversations, it would be unruly and unmanageable. So we've got to be able to think about restoratively at the level of the larger process and then bring that way of working to each of the parts of that work and the way that we do it. You can then scale that up to think about how do we imagine truth commission processes, and thinking about large scale social and structural change, whether that be following a period of mass human rights problems or of societal level conflict, or whether it's at the level of a TRC like we had in Canada, where we're trying to actually shift colonial attitudes and relationships that, while not, violent war or outbreak or conflict in that sense, actually is an enduring societal need for transition. I think in all those cases we need to be thinking about, and this is, I think, what is important about this question of how do we take a restorative approach to this idea of investigating, of understanding, of inquiry, and have that be integrated in a holistic way with the work of building the sorts of relationships people need to learn and understand, right? Need to be able to walk further together in the future. And so I do think we can scale this up But I think in scaling this up, we need to be taking a restorative approach that's rooted at this principled level rather than at the level of particular practices we could use to address this.
Fascinating. When you're talking about the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children inquiry, and you're incorporating all of these different bodies like the police and the province, et cetera, how are they involving themselves? And is there a sense that that change will permeate through their work?
Yeah. So we did two things I think are helpful in understanding how the process is run on that front. One is that we were quite committed to understanding that you have to be like good caseworkers would in a straight up restorative process, that some of the process and support that needs to happen has to happen within groups before you bring them together. So working at various different levels and moving back and forth in that regard. So intra-group processes, which is really important for the African Nova Scotian community, for example, who don't, who need to be able to confront and deal with and understand what's happened in a safe way that doesn't feed stereotypes or misunderstandings of their community. It's also, sort of true for policing community or for those in social workers and the social care system. So working at different levels, so allowing those communities to come together to create opportunities for them to reflect themselves on what's happened and amongst themselves, because then you're actually creating that shared understanding for them to be able to participate further with others. So we did a lot of work in the initial stages in terms of preparing people in that way. The other thing we did structurally is it's quite hard for government when there's many different parts and departments and silos within government to participate in a holistic and meaningful way, but also to provide the kind of support that government needs to participate fully, right? So in a typical inquiry, they sit back and wait for the recommendations, and then they've got to kind of mobilize that through a committee or whoever reviews the recommendations and divide it up and assume who's responsible. We wanted in real time government to be participating fully within the process, because we saw part of the work of this doing things in a different way was building trust and understanding as an outcome, essentially, through the process. And so we did that structurally by creating an entity called the Reflection and Action Team, who are all the deputy ministers, so that sort of highest level civil servant from all of the departments and areas of government most connected, who have met monthly through the entire inquiry. And their task is to understand in real time and to be facilitating and knowing what they need to know to facilitate and support full participation of government in the process all the way along, and also taking the learnings in real time along the way so that they can show up and be fully engaged. We also created a different kind of way that commissioners would lead this inquiry. They lead through what's called a council of parties, and the commissioners include those from government, those from community, from the African Nova Scotian community, representatives from the institution, the home, who were previously involved in the governance of that, and former residents. And we work together as a group of commissioners on a council of parties in order to think about facilitating the full participation of various groups and constituents to ensure the process is such that it can be a meaningful catalyst for them to come to learn and understand together, and then to be able to take action together. So we've been very aware of the need to build that capacity and to include people in the process itself as a catalyst for why they're not going to feel any collective responsibility over the outcomes of a process if they didn't have some collective responsibility and participation in the process itself.
With a process like this that's focused so much on a large and maybe an issue that people want to ignore, like systemic racism, is there an effort to include the general population that is not the African Nova Scotia community?
Yeah, for sure. And so in this case, we've had to think about how to do that in a way that is safe, because there are harms and conversations that need to happen internal to the community. And also we need to think about, so how do you make it a public inquiry when you want to create space for people to have these conversations that it's easy to have a sort of public testimony. It's harder to have these kinds of conversations and learning space conducive to learning while at the same time public. So we've done that in a couple of ways. One is we think about the various publics that are involved and need to be engaged, and have been including and involving them as is appropriate in the actual work of the inquiry. So reaching out to community-based organizations in the broader Nova Scotia community who are connected to kids in care, or who are connected to issues of institutional, responding to issues of institutional abuse, or who are thinking about education and the care system more broadly. So we've been very broad in terms of who is invited in and actually participates in the process. We've issued public reports along the way that are sharing what we're learning and understanding, that are sharing the process we're following so that people can understand along the way their learning and engagement with these issues. We've had sharings and events where we come and share how this process is going and invited people in to be part of those public conversations where we have broader opportunities for people to come and share and talk together about what matters about this example for where we go together as a province. And so I think it's every bit a public inquiry, but that doesn't mean that everything is held in public. But we are really clear that it's in the public interest and it's intended to be for the broader benefit and learning of the public so they can participate in and understand that social change.
Who are the people that are facilitating all the various processes that are happening throughout? Where do they learn their skills, or who are they?
So I think this is a great question. I think in these early days, there's a small group of people who've had experience in this kind of facilitation, and we hope that through these kinds of experiences, others are interested in thinking about how do they approach their work, wherever that work be, whether it's in schools or it's in the justice system or it's in businesses, that they approach the responsibilities and the roles they have restoratively. So rather than just create sort of a roving set of freelance restorative facilitators, we're trying to build that skill and capacity in the province more broadly in terms of within those institutional frames. We've been lucky in some sense that we've been able to draw on the expertise of having had a restorative justice program for youth that's been province-wide since 2001, and that has community-based agencies that have been the facilitators of those processes. And so there is a significant set of experience in terms of the facilitation skills and of thinking about that at the level of what does it take for community to feel safe and to convene and to come into these processes. But it is actually an issue, right? Because it's not a simple matter of just, train a bunch of people to have these skills, when what we realize is we need people who understand things about the issues, because they have to not just be holding space and asking the questions. They do have to have those facilitation skills, but they have to actually be able to understand and think about the kind of decisions you have to make to design these sorts of processes, to think who should come next, to be thinking about who needs to be in the room with who, sort of at that level of the inquiry itself. So we have had a team of facilitators that worked really closely with the inquiry, drawn from community, drawn from the Council of Parties. So that leadership of the Council of Parties, those commissioners, instead of sitting there sort of watching all this happen, have actually been playing facilitative roles to gather people together, and others who are on that have been acquiring those skills. So I think that is one of the things that we hope over time will become easier, right, as people have more and more experience of that at a level and a depth that is less just about practice skills, but also about this as a way of thinking and a way of understanding the nature of the work and the way in which we make choices about how to move the work forward.
Okay. Are you able to speak at all about the province-wide program that was initially for youth and then expanded to adults? I don't know if that's, yeah.
Sure. So that's a really interesting case, in part because that's one of the the spaces where the influence of thinking about inquiry restoratively is starting to have an impact. So that province-wide program has been in place across the province, accessible at all entry points of the criminal justice system for young people until 2016 when it was rolled out for adults. And we've just recently undergone a process, and the new protocols are available on the Nova Scotia Department of Justice website, to integrate, to take sort of all the lessons we've learned from working in that, working in this way for, since 2001, and to integrate a set of protocols that is true for both young people and adults, right? So how is it that the justice system stakeholders and partners, police, Crown, the courts, corrections, will work together to take responsibility for this as a way of working, and to do that in a common, connected way on the youth side of the house and the adult side of the house. But what's been really interesting is to see the impact of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission starting to think about how do we approach the process of investigation and inquiry, of figuring out what happened, of fact-finding restoratively, what is important about that truth-finding, and of this restorative inquiry example to those who are now thinking about the importance of that as one of the stages, one of the things we need to pay attention to in terms of the restorative justice program aligned with the criminal justice system. So like many programs around the world, the access to that program is gained by an acknowledgement of responsibility. What's significant in our context is that's not an admission of guilt. And it is really important, actually, we need to talk more about this, that people say, I was there, like, look, what do we mean by an acknowledgement of responsibility? Well, it can't be that they're acknowledging they're at a level that we expect them to understand all of what they're responsible for in order to get into a restorative process, right? What we basically mean is you're not denying you did it. You're not denying, and the it may be in question, but you're not denying that you were connected to this, you were involved in this, you bear some responsibility to be addressing what happened. What we actually don't mean is that you have to admit what happened in terms of the system's understanding of what happened. One of the beauties of a restorative approach to justice, particularly in the context of systemic racism or discrimination or injustice, where the surveillance and the policing of certain populations is more than other populations, and where the root causes of what's happening are not simple, right? It's not just admit responsibility for what happened and not look at the social responsibility for why these things are happening. One of the beauties of responding restoratively is that we do say, let's go through a process of understanding what you're actually responsible for and what other responsibilities for context, causes, inequalities may be at play here, right? We do think, if we do it well, that those restorative justice responses should be open to understanding that before we're just figuring out what needs to happen about it. And when restorative justice is done poorly, where it masks those important issues that might be revealed if we paid attention to this inquiry, fact-finding, truth-seeking process, is when we get in a room and say, okay, we're all agreed about what happened. Let's make a contract about what you're going to do for the victim. What do we do next, right? And we see lots of practice around restorative justice. This is actually about making a deal, making a contract, making a plan, making a settlement, and we skip over that. It really actually matters that we come to understand this. Not that just we agree to an outcome, that we invest the time to understand what happened, because it's that understanding that's going to matter to the way forward, to whether the plan is just or will work, or is actually going to address the harms and the needs and the issues at stake.
Is there a sense that the state or other bodies are making changes or taking accountability for their side of whatever the underlying issues are?
In the inquiry, certainly in the Home for Colored Children inquiry, every once in a while you have the right time and the right set of political circumstances. And in that case, the inquiry started with the first apology in Canada for systemic first provincial apology in Canada for systemic racism.
Mm.
And so there is a current leader, our current premier, has been very clear that he's committed to this inquiry, to having said sorry, and then figuring out what it means, like what we're sorry for, what it means to move forward together, and sees the restorative inquiry as the catalyst for beginning that walking together into the future and figuring out what it's going to require. So there's been quite a remarkable level of engagement and commitment and willingness. It hasn't been easy, right? Lots of fear too. We kind of joke that every time we walk in a room, people's shoulders are like way up around their ears, wondering what this is going to be. And then sort of, with this kind of quizzical, you mean that we are actually going to be able to be part of the solution and not just identified as the problem? So, that's about culture, that's about expectations. But we've had quite a lot of commitment to that. I think on the scale of the smaller scale restorative processes, it's why it's so critical that we start to think about, if we paid attention to this stage of figuring out what happened and understanding it fully, I think it would make much more sense to us about why we need to be giving careful consideration in each process about who the broader community is and who we need to be involving other than just the victim and offender and a facilitator from the community, right? Mm-hmm. Because if we want to get at these issues of who does this matter to, how does this matter, and what else matters for us to understand what actually happened here and what needs to change, that collective and social responsibility needs to come in the room somehow, needs to be in the room somehow to participate in that coming to understand process, so that it's not so narrowly focused only on the incident and the direct parties, but that it's focused on them, mindful of the context and circumstances and causes that matter to understanding what happened fully, to understanding those responsibilities, and to thinking about a way forward. And so, I think that's hard, right? I think that is like at a practice level, if we don't think about why we're bringing community in the room, right? And we don't know who that would be, like, how do we operationalize that? Are we just finding the community volunteers who always come? I think really beginning to understand the significance of this part of the process where we need to be participating together in bringing our knowledge and bringing our perspectives and bringing our understanding, because we're trying to figure out this truth-seeking understanding before we just move forward, makes a lot more sense of who do you need in the room and why. And at a practice level, I think that's going to take some growth and development in terms of then having to design processes in a way that ask those kinds of questions and have the flexibility to have different people kind of participate in figuring out how we do that in a way that understands the connectedness of these larger social issues to these particular incidences, that doesn't sort of overwhelm the people who care about the particular incident, but also doesn't paper over all of the stuff that's actually connected and related to it.
Okay. I am not sure what people can see on their screen right now.
Just your face.
Just my face. Mm-hmm. I wonder what that happened. Okay, well, I had one final question for you, which is, how did you become this person who is renowned for these large restorative justice processes? What was your path? What drew you to restorative justice?
Well, those might be different questions. What drew me to restorative justice is probably my upbringing, right? So I'm the daughter of a United Church minister, and I spent a lot of time learning about social justice in terms of relationships and how you show up in community and how people relate to one another. Like, this kind of idea of justice being about just relations was pretty hardwired in me. So that's probably the long explanation for how I wound up caring about this and thinking about the world this way. I owe that credit to the people who raised me. I think how did I wind up involved in these sort of bigger issues? I have a sort of a simple answer, which is I help So mostly the way I get involved in these is people showing up and saying, can you help us think this through? And I think there's a role for helping, for accompanying, for being part of that, for partnering in that, rather than leading that in a way. So for in most of these circumstances, it's been because I'm willing to walk alongside those whose issues and whose harms are most central to these issues. So whether that's residential school survivors, or the those in the home for colored children, or the women in dentistry, or the men in dentistry, and I think that's I think that's important. I think the way that those of us who want to be able to help and move this forward need to move this forward. Of course, there's work to kind of do at the publishing level, or at the policy level, or but I think real change comes from meeting the needs of real people, and of being able to help imagine a different way forward. And that's probably the most compelling reason to do the work, and also I think the way that you get to do the work that matters most. So maybe I just answer my phone.
Thank you. That's great. That's it for me. Really an honor to have this time with you. So thank you so much.
You too. Come back to Canada when you're done there.
I will.
I'm sorry that I was muted. Anyway, these are announcements for the webinars that are coming up. October 16th is the next one. November 20th will be the one with our alumna, Caitlin Morneau, on harm, healing, and human dignity, Catholics in RJ. And our final one this semester will be on December 11th, Signs and Symbols of the Restorative Justice Movement, with Carl Stoffer, who is one of our professors of restorative justice. He will be talking about his experiences during his sabbatical last semester. Next slide. This year is also the Center for Justice and Peace Building's 25th anniversary. And if you're wondering what the connection is, the Zehr Institute is under the umbrella of the Center for Justice and Peace Building. And we are celebrating our 25th year. And we invite you to to join us in all our activities. And you can check those out at emu.edu/CJP, which is Center for Justice and Peace Building /anniversary. There will be some courses with our strategies for trauma awareness and resilience, which is also another one of our programs under the umbrella of the Center for Justice and Peace Building. STAR Level 2 is coming up on November 18th through 22nd, and Level 1 on January 6th through 10 of 2020. Check that out at emu.edu/CJP/STAR. And we have graduate and certificate programs in restorative justice. Check those out at our website. That's right there. So thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you can join us on October 16th. Oh, right, we also have restorative justice and education programs, and we will have that slide available to you on our recording, and you can come visit it. That's under emu.edu MA in Education, Restorative Justice. So, I think that's it. All right, thank you for joining us, and see you on October 16th. Thank you very much. Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Julian. All right, have a good evening.